So an analogy, as we all know, because we use analogies constantly, we literally cannot think without making analogies. There's a lot of very interesting psychological literature on that. An analogy makes a comparison between two elements, usually, that are thought to be alike in some ways, either quite completely or partially. And that's where the idea, obviously, of likening comes from. And it occurred to me a really long time ago. In fact, I found the email to my then research assistant from 2005, where I had started to see this pattern, not in works of art, and I think this is one of the questions and challenges about this exhibition, but in literature about those works of art. I can't remember where I first found them, but I think the first one that I found was the one over on this side that we'll talk about a little bit later, that Homer Watson is the Canadian constable. Anyway, so I've since that time been putting this together, but it occurred to me only more recently, maybe about 5 years ago, that this might be a really good thing to test out in the visual, because these likenings are absolutely everywhere, not only in the art world, of course, they're all over our culture. But when somebody says that Thomson was Canada's Van Gogh, or William Kurelek was Canada's Van Gogh, I think we have a really, really interesting situation of trying to negotiate what exactly is meant. Very often for me, and this is part of the idea of getting a little bit of distance on likening, the comparisons that are made are invalid, foolish, or else really, really interesting, and along that spectrum. But just because somebody articulates it in a catalog, or the Thomson Van Gogh one came from a film, one of the more recent films on Thomson, and it was said in a very reverential tone. Just because somebody articulates that doesn't mean that we need to go along with it. Or that we need to go along with all of the implications of a particular comparison. And as we go around today, I'd be really interested in what people think about the comparisons that we've put on the wall here. Most of the work, as you know, is from McMaster's extraordinary collection, the collection in this museum, with really strategic and wonderful loans from the Art Gallery of Hamilton and Museum London, and one art dealer as well. So it is focused on what's possible in a particular context. So that's another sense of the distance, is actually, I think I'm a little bit suspicious of this whole process of making these likenings. So we wanted to start the show with something that's going to catch people's attention, and I think more than any of the comparisons here, some of which I feel better and worse about, is the Thomson Van Gogh comparison. Because really, it isn't a comparison about art at all. I suppose if you had just the right Thomson and just the right, sort of post-impressionist Van Gogh, you might talk about color and you might talk about impasto, but I think you'd be stretching, frankly. The comparison is based on the tragedy of the lives, or the perceived tragedy of the lives, the early death, suicide, who knows what happened to Thomson. People are still speculating on that. So on the one hand, it's a kind of non-starter as a visual comparison. Not completely, but it's a little bit distant again. And it's probably good that I have a full-time job as an art historian and not a curator, that I would start a show with a visual non-starter. That's maybe not the best strategy that one could ever articulate, and that's why I think this is kind of brave of the MMA to take this on. So for me, it is the idea that the visual kind of calls the bluff. Putting the visual up in front of us calls the bluff of these usually textual, in one form or another, analogies that are made between different artists. There is, I'd be really, really interested, obviously, in other examples that you know of, or indeed that you make up on the spot. People tend to get into doing that. But in my research on this, I have never found an artist comparison that wasn't hierarchical in some way. Some of them more than others, but they tend to, especially national ones, tend to trade on a built-in hierarchy. And I've said in the catalog text and also on the station text that you see here, that Canada really can't have a Vincent Van Gogh for all kinds of reasons, especially not in 1915 or so when Thomson was at his prime. So it's something that is laudatory, obviously, for Thomson and for his status and memory, but it's not seen to be level and equal, and that's part of the purpose. And this is a fairly innocent one. I think it's meant to be just praise for the most part. But some of the likenings in this exhibit, especially the Picasso and Morisot one that's in the back part of the gallery that we will get to, I mean, there are real problems with it culturally as well as art historically. And I think that's very, very common in likenings. So the other distance that I'm kind of hoping that you will adopt is to not take these at face value, as I've said, and to be just a little bit skeptical about the use of language that really structures how we see, I think, really structures how we see artists and art in comparison with each other. Not all of the works in the exhibit trade on this kind of national comparison. This one certainly does. Maybe we can look a little bit more at the Homer Watson as the Canadian constable. That one, that's okay. People can move around either side of it. That certainly trades at not that much earlier. This Oscar Wilde made this statement when he was on tour of galleries in Toronto and in Boston, and he was on a kind of speaking tour and raising money, basically. So that was 1882, and the comparisons that we're seeing here are just into the 20th century. But it's still one that compares very unequal artists and very unequal national status at this point. And something that I've done a little bit of work on, but I'd really like to think about more, is how empire really works in that comparison. Because of course Canada is very much proudly part of the British Empire at this time in the late 19th century. And to be compared with one of the more famous artists from Britain, it's kind of the best thing that you could possibly say about someone. But it dogged Homer Watson for his entire life. He was, it was one of those things where somebody had said this and you're just going to get asked about it and asked about it. Even though he was extremely successful, his work was collected by Queen Victoria, not before actually, this Oscar Wilde statement. So there again, it's another kind of disparity, and what I've tried to do with the exhibition and the accompanying text is to kind of pry open these stereotypes or these cliches. Whether or not you had heard this one, you might or might not have. But with better known artists like Picasso, like Morisot, certainly Thomson and Van Gogh, you would have heard some of these statements go by. Just while we're in this part of the gallery, we kind of have a suite of national comparisons. And in addition to please don't move. We're going to look right over at people who are looking at these. Thanks. This one between George Grosz, a German painter, early 20th and then through the 20th century, came to the United States, and William Hogarth, as you know, 18th century British caricaturist and painter. This one is really interesting to me because it plays a totally different theme. I don't know that Tom Thomson ever thought very much about Van Gogh. He wouldn't necessarily have had the chutzpah to say, yeah, I'm there. I'm like, you know, Vincent. Kurelek, yes, because Kurelek really modeled himself on Van Gogh and his piety, his perceived piety and his poverty, etc. So that's another case. But when you move to Grosz and Hogarth, it was actually George Grosz who said, I want to be the William Hogarth of Germany. So it's aspirational instead of something that's just being generated by, you know, a curator someplace or somebody who's writing, you know, a review, an exhibition review or an art history text. And I think that this comparison between Hogarth and Grosz is one that, contrary to what I said about the Thomson and Van Gogh, perhaps, is one that really pays close visual attention. It isn't, you know, one-to-one with this work and this work, but I think there is a lot in the George Grosz, you know, 2 centuries later, that really is very like what Hogarth was doing, the kind of cruel caricatures and satires of his own society or elements of his own society. The really pained exploration of depravity that you find in both of them, kind of unflinching. And in the vitrine for the Grosz and Hogarth section, we also have George Grosz's very, very well-known book, the Ecce Homo, which we can't really turn the pages in it. Most of them are really lewd, or the gallery would have to put some kind of, you know, if you're under 18, you can't look at this picture here, or whatever the cutoff age is now. But probably not here. But again, it gives you the sense that, like Hogarth, who, as you know, disseminated most of his works in print form, Grosz is trying to do that. He's not only trying to observe his society with that same kind of unjaundiced, or perhaps it's jaundiced eye, but he's trying to circulate that information really, really widely, which is done in the book form and is done in print form. So to look at things just a little bit more broadly for a second, all 3 of the comparisons, well, really 4 when you think that there are 2 with Vincent van Gogh, are meant to kind of play out some of the themes around comparing artists within the rubric of comparing nations. And it's still astounding to me just how many different variations there are on that theme. We probably could have played out more, but because I wanted Struck by Likening to explore some of the other types of analogies that are made across media, across gender, which wasn't possible to do here, but would have been a good thing to do, we kind of left it at these 3. Just one other thing, and then surely somebody has an objection or an interjection or something at this point. There's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek move curatorially that I have to say Ihor very willingly collaborated on, which is with the Vincent van Gogh that you see there, the beautiful still life. You'll notice if you've been through the Levy collection exhibition that's downstairs that there's one that looks a lot like this. How did that happen? And yet the one downstairs has this rather modern, beautifully designed frame on it, and this has this older frame on it. When it became apparent that the Vincent van Gogh was needed for the show downstairs, we thought, uh-oh, this whole part of the show pivots on having this painting here. What are we going to do? So this is a reproduction, and a really good one. Actually, most of us like it better. I think it's because of the frame. This is the frame in which Herman Levy got painting when he bought it. But I think we can turn this kind of curatorial impasse, as it was for a few minutes, to advantage, because really what we're talking about here, not just with this comparison, but with the Homer Watson painting and the David Lucas reproduction of a constable, because there unfortunately isn't a constable in this collection, we're talking about replication. We're talking about mirroring in some way. We're talking about distorting very, very often. So nobody is trying to suggest that this is an authentic or original Van Gogh painting, but really what happens with analogy and with how we see art now so frequently in reproduction on a screen or wherever, is that there is this kind of reverberation. And I think that likening is a reverberation, that whether we are conscious of it or not, is structuring how we understand art and artists. So I think, for me, on the largest plane, what the show wanted to do was to kind of put a little wedge in that and make us slow down and think about our language, and slow down and think about our habits of making comparisons. That's correct. Okay. And actually at the back of the catalog is a list of the sources. I was really scholarly about this, in case you thought that I was making this stuff up. But they're so weird that you couldn't make them up, right? A lot of them. But yeah, that... and I find, as an art historian, I find that very interesting, that a lot of our information about the visual does not come from the visual. And you could go all pure and say, oh, it should always come from your observation first, and you shouldn't be reading things. But I think that's implausible, actually. As we take in information and our ideas are formed, you know, in so many different ways and from so many different sources that we're more or less aware of. So again, the show tries to kind of pry that open just a little bit. That's a really good comment, thank you. I haven't really looked at it, but I think it actually happens quite a bit. You know, there's something that we're familiar with, something that we're a little bit worried about, we're less familiar with. So by drawing an analogy, we have a little bit more comfort with it. And that could be for commercial reasons as well as for aesthetic reasons. It's really a smart idea. I think that I think you could probably find all kinds of examples. And where would you look for that? Maybe in auction catalogs, something where people are making those comparisons. Interestingly enough, with Wilde and Watson, it kind of worked that way. There's no question that it helped Homer Watson to a certain extent. And but Wilde was apparently kind of guileless about it. And he went on to support Homer Watson for the rest of his life, bought paintings, got other people to buy his paintings. But it could have been a commercial strategy. It kind of feels like one in retrospect. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good idea. There's a huge amount of authority, and I'd be interested to know where it comes from, of just actually putting the comparison up. Because I don't know whether it's Gestalt psychology or what it is, we will look for similarities. And I suspect that that's hardwired somehow. I would like to think, I hope, that the comparisons that are set up here sometimes can be revelatory. I've been pretty skeptical, that's cast of mind. But some of them can actually reveal to you too. Once I see for longer and longer, you know, the visual of, you know, the Constable and the Watson or others, you start to look and you start to think, well, maybe that wasn't just a cliche that this person spun off, you know, in an exhibition catalog. Maybe there was something in it. Or, and this might be a good time for us to move into the back part of the gallery, maybe the Morisot Picasso is just outrageous and we're not going to stand for it. I don't know. We'll see. So as you probably have figured out already, this whole portion of the gallery doesn't so much pivot around Picasso as the phenomenon of fame. Because as far as I can tell, and I have done amateurish searches on this, but I'm pretty sure I can say that in the Western canon anyway, no one is likened to as often as Picasso. You will go through and you'll get 1,000 hits on that, and you'll get, 20 with Matisse or, someone else who's pretty important. So all kinds of artists, for all kinds of reasons, are compared with Picasso. And what I was trying to do in this part of the exhibit was to pull out a few of those threads within the context of this collection and within the context of Canada. The best thing to have happen, the next stage for this show, I think, is to take it to the Picasso Museum and get every single nationality. I bet you could get 100 who were likened to this great artist. I mean, as if the Picasso industry needed a boost. But I think you could actually do that. So you have the artists within this somewhat more confined, but not humble category, who have been likened to Picasso. Behind us on this wall, that print by Harold Town. Ihor and I talked about this a fair bit, and we tried to quiet Harold Town down a bit. The gallery has a big, what's it called, the big painting? Inscape Outscape or something. And there's a big, kind of tremendous Harold Town painting. It was part of Painters 11 in this province, very big very big for a very long time, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and changed styles, like shoes. It was amazing in that way. But it would have unbalanced the show in a certain way, and it would have taken away from the idea of actually figuring out some of these comparisons. But Harold Town has been called the Picasso of Canada, and you think, well, why? Is it because he was a notorious womanizer? I'm sure that that's part of it. I'm sure that that's in some people's minds when they're making the analogy. Is it because Town, like Picasso, was thought of as somebody who was just so amazing about creating new ideas? Because Town will go through this series, that series, etc., etc. So again, you're not really getting a visual comparison, although Town, this is another thing to say about cliches, and my own kind of path through this as a curator. I initially treated most of these as cliches and thought I knew what they meant, okay, that some of the ideas that I've just said. But when you really start reading about Town, you find that there are actually quite a few connections with Picasso, and some of them were quite purposeful. And he talks about being inspired by a certain kind of work, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's more depth than you might expect. But that's one. The middle piece over here is Wifredo Lam, Cuban artist who was part of the Surrealist circle in Europe, has been called the Picasso of Cuba because, as with Van Gogh, every country has to have its Picasso. It's just remarkable when you start looking. We could probably find some stylistic similarities if we pulled Picasso work from, I think we don't know the exact date on this piece, but if we looked at the kind of surrealist inclinations that Picasso, like most artists in Europe, had for a certain time, yeah, you could probably find comparisons. But again, it's more that pattern of claiming that connection. And Picasso and Lam knew each other. I mean, it isn't, sometimes the comparisons will go over many, many, many centuries. And so there's no possibility of contact. That isn't something that we've really explored in this show, but there are those likenings. And the McMaster Museum of Art has a pretty deep collection of Picasso prints, and I think that I was torn between putting up ones that allowed for some kind of visual comparison and just the best ones that you have. So there are ones in both categories here, and I won't say which are which. I'll let you decide on your own how you want that to work. Then just working from the other side for a moment in this Picasso concatenation, two photographers, and this really surprised me. There were actually more than two, but we decided to just stay at two. Henri Cartier-Bresson beside the Picasso print, and Edward Weston, the two, the nude and the woman with the tree silhouette, were both called at different times by different people the Picasso of photography. What does that mean? And this really fascinates me. When you start going across media to make a comparison, is it just adulation? Are you just trying to say, yeah, this guy was a really good photographer. He was almost as good as Picasso was at everything. I mean, maybe there's just some of that. But I have to say, looking at the two Westons, which are from the University of Toronto collection, should have mentioned that before, you start to kind of think about the fascination with the female body, etc. And of course, lots of people had that. But Picasso more notoriously than anyone. So maybe it's not just a kind of throwaway line. And again, I'm back to that point about the authority of actually putting work on the wall. I don't know that anyone else has ever taken these comparisons as literally as I have, slightly tongue-in-cheek, and actually put them on the wall. Okay, if you want to say that Weston and Cartier-Bresson are the Picassos of photography, well, how does that work? Picasso was not a photographer. I'm sure he took photographs, and there are incredibly famous photographs taken of him by Dora Maar, I guess, most famously, and it's amazing. But you know, you don't see him as a pioneer in that medium. He wasn't. It's one of the few things he didn't do. So again, the comparison is both, to me, a little bit odd, but also worth pausing on for a little while. And you can find, if you have a kind of universal scope, you can find other comparisons with different artists that go across media to a certain extent. And then there's the one that Ihor mentioned, that Norval Morrisseau, which again, the collection here is really, really strong, is, and I've seen two quotations, although I can only now find one of them, which is annoying, is the Picasso of the North. That's the one that you see most often. And the question about the commercial is really interesting, because you will find on commercial galleries that sell Morisot's work, you will find that quotation as if it was it's just a really great thing. He's the Picasso of the North. I have also seen, and I just have to spend more time tracking it down again, and this is the one which is insulting, I think, and gets you into the darker side of these comparisons, that Norval Morrisseau was the Picasso of the woods. That has also been stated. And if you take either of them, but especially the latter, what you embrace, willingly or not, is the discourse of primitivism. That Norval Morrisseau, coming from an indigenous context, is, fantastically strong, but it's all kind of unthinking. And he's coming out of this primitivist bias. All of that gets kind of taken up by the likening. And that's just absolutely not true in any way. And especially when the comparison is with Picasso, who was notorious for his poachings from other cultures on a strictly formal level. In the Trocadero Museum in Paris, for example, African masks, Iberian sculpture, just kind of taking what he wanted without any sensitivity to its cultural context. When you make that comparison with Morisot, you really do have problems, it seems to me, that you want to think about. And art history in the curatorial world, and probably the commercial world too, I think should be thinking about some of those comparisons. But this is something that I really learned curating this show, was that initially I saw the cliche and I was kind of outraged by it. And then I did some research after that, and I guess it's not on this panel, it's on the panel in the very front, so on the other side of the interior space here, which we will end with in about 15 minutes. I think somebody said 20 after. Is that right? Okay, 10 minutes. What you notice there is that Picasso and Morisot, there's still speculation on whether they ever met. Probably not. But they were showing at galleries in the south of France at the same time. There's a wonderful photograph on that other panel that shows the poster for the Picasso show and the Morisot show on the same wall. You know, so these shows were contemporary. We know that Morisot greatly admired Picasso and sent him work. That this kind of goes through intermediaries all the time, that Picasso was very approving of, but we don't know whether he ever said that to Morisot. Probably not. So what goes from a kind of, you know, slightly offhand cultural cliche about primitivism starts to become this kind of embroiled historical interconnection that I don't pretend that I've done more than just to kind of put it there as something that we should think about more. But it's certainly the most, I think, it's the most controversial one here, and of course that's important in itself, but it also, again, goes back to my kind of doctrine of suspicion here, that we should be careful when it's not as if we're not going to liken artists, or we're not going to say things in other contexts. You know, like Nelson Mandela was the Lincoln of Africa. That was a headline that I saw when Nelson Mandela died. And you kind of, you know, you get your head around it, but it's a little bit difficult. There were a lot of protests about that when it came out as a headline, and there were a lot of people who also defended it as a likening. This one is in that same category. In a couple of minutes, I want to end with what I respectfully call the Inner Sanctum. But I wanted to end the exhibition, or maybe it's better to say have the center of the exhibition be a more speculative likening, because we all tend to kind of spin these out consciously now. So it's based on a connection that was made in 1965 with a Jack Chambers, famous London, Ontario artist, painting that was shown in New York. And the reviewer in New York, a woman named Anne Hone, said that he, Chambers, is the Puvis de Chavannes of Canada. And you go, what? Who is Puvis de Chavannes? Well, luckily, the Art Gallery of Hamilton has this fantastic small Puvis de Chavannes, very important classicist painter from the later part of the 19th century in France. And, you know, in London or in Toronto, people were thinking of Chambers in very different ways, and I'm not sure who he was being compared with because his work was so different for most people here. But actually, I think this makes a huge amount of sense, because Chambers himself saw himself as a classicist. He saw himself as restricting his medium, his motion, etc., while doing very radical things with it. So if you have a painting like Olga and Mary Visiting, which I think is one of Chambers' best paintings, putting this comparison up draws your eye to those particular elements, perhaps, in both paintings. Or, if you're like Andy Patton, it makes you say, no, those are totally different. How could anybody compare those paintings?
I can buy that.
You can buy this one. Okay, so that's one part of this dialogue, but it becomes a trialogue because, and I can't remember when this happened first, but I think it was in a seminar that I was giving some years ago at U of T on Chambers. Because Ihor and I curated a show on Chambers a few years ago, which was really fun to do. And one of the smart graduate students, so smart that he's now a curator at the National Gallery, said, well, could you say, or I would say that Jack Chambers is the Gerhard Richter of Canada. Gerhard Richter being the only living artist represented in this exhibition. Certainly one of the most famous painters in the world, whether you think he deserves that title or not. I think he kind of does. And it stuck, that idea. Well, maybe there's something to it. Again, Richter calls himself a classicist, perhaps not in exactly the same way as Puvis de Chavannes, but he sees himself as doing that. So in some of these photo paintings, as they're called, and the MMA has two fantastic Richters, totally different ones, a monochrome and this one. You get that kind of diffusion and blurring that Chambers is playing with too. So I think it's almost too much as a visual comparison with the heads, etc. It almost pulls them closer than they really are. But I think it shows the power of these likenings that I am also at the same time suspicious of. If you have any comments about this or anything else, I think we're at our end of lunch time, but I'm not going in. Thanks. Great.